Ph.D. in Bible from Union Presbyterian Seminary, and he also has a passion in helping Christians understand Muslims, our Muslim brothers and sisters. And in the world, the fractious world that we live in, that seems like a very important thing to work on. And incidentally, he's also my husband. I actually am not able tonight to stay for the presentation, that our day school has a board meeting tonight and I'm on that board. So I'm actually going to make use of the taped session. But I hope you have a wonderful evening and good evenings to you.
I don't do this with everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the encouragement. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm really excited and pleased and honored to be able to talk to you a little bit about Islam and do it from a kind of a Christian point of view. I want to start with, actually, this is the second slide, but I just want to say that, I titled this Islam for Christians for a reason. I'm interested in trying to help Christians to think in a Christian way about Islam, take a Christian approach to Islam. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. I'm a Christian, and for me that means that God has spoken to me. And so I believe certain things because I have this kind of relationship with God. And most Christians, most people that call themselves Christians, I think if you talk to them for a while, they'll be able to say, yes, God has spoken to me. God somehow has a relationship, or I have a feeling, or some kind of sense that what God says is true. And for me to be a Christian, that means that I place a lot of stock in the Bible, and I believe that there's something very special about Jesus Christ, that He's the Son of God, and that He is the way to be okay with God, to have a good relationship with God. And I just want to say at the start that this is my way of looking at Christianity, and I think that most Christians tend to think of our faith more or less in those terms. So this is going to be very, very important through the presentation. In fact, I want to start off, only partly because I'm a Baptist, I want to start off by talking about the Bible. So I've been teaching New Testament the last couple of years for Regent University. And I just want to say a little bit about some passages from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, most Christians, we tend to lean more on the New Testament than the Old Testament. And Matthew is actually the first book of the New Testament. I think a lot of us know this. And the first words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, the first words of Jesus, the first teaching of Jesus in the New Testament is the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a couple of verses that I take very seriously when I look to Islam. And I know the print's a little bit small here. I think most Christians will know these verses. In Matthew 7, 1 and 2, Jesus says, "Do not judge that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged. And the measure you give will be the measure you get." So for me, now when I think about Muslims, the standards that we use to judge Muslims are the standards that God will use to judge us. I think that that's what Jesus is saying. Matthew 7:12 is another one. I think almost everyone knows this verse. "And everything do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets," the golden rule. So we Christians must treat Muslims as we want Muslims to treat us. If we are Christians and we take God's word seriously, we take Jesus seriously, the New Testament seriously, then we have to consider these words when we look at Islam. And I'm starting off with this because this really affects everything that I'm going to be saying for the next 6 weeks. So we're going to see this right at the start, because the next question I want to ask is, how can Christians learn about what Muslims believe? I'm not going to be able to teach you everything about Islam in 6 weeks. Islam is much more complicated and is much more depth than someone can learn in a lifetime. So this is a very basic kind of introduction. But before we even start that, we want to think about how we are going to learn what it is that our Muslim neighbors or Muslims in the world believe. There's, as you all know, there's lots and lots and lots of information out there. And the information doesn't agree, isn't all consistent. And we all have to kind of sort of figure out which information is right and which information is not right. I'm hoping that everyone here really wants the truth. And whether it's bad or good, that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for correct, accurate information. And that's part of my Christian calling, to understand truth. So as we're doing this, we want to apply Matthew 7. How would we want Muslims to learn about what we Christians believe? And the way I think about this, I kind of imagine that there's a group of Muslims, maybe 35 or 40 Muslims getting together in a mosque, and they want to understand Christianity. They want to understand what Christians believe. They want to understand what Christians in Hampton Roads actually believe. They want the truth. So the question is then, what would we as Christians tell these Muslims? How would we advise them to learn the truth about what we really, really, truly believe? So I came up with a few ideas. By the way, what I'm intending to do is to keep this to about 40 or 45 minutes and then open it up for questions. So if you can, I think it would work best if you just hold your questions to the end, and I'll make sure that there's some time. So at this point, what would we tell Muslims if they want to learn about Christianity, about what we actually truly believe? Now, I started off with some bad answers, things that probably don't work. First of all, read the Bible directly. Now, I'm a Baptist. My wife told you that. Baptists, especially, big fans of the Bible. Even worse, I have a Ph.D. in Bible. So I'm a huge fan of the Bible, and I'm going to say that learning about Christianity, reading the Bible straight through, is not really going to be a huge help. Why is that? It's because all Christians, even Baptists and Bible guys, understand that there are parts of the Bible that we look to more than other parts. There's some verses that we all think are much more significant and important theologically than different verses. And there's a kind of method to the way Christians read the Bible. Most of us, we kind of prioritize the New Testament ahead of the Old Testament. And even with the New Testament, there are some passages that we think are more important and significant than other passages. And it actually gets a little bit involved. You think through it. It's a little bit involved as to how we sort of use the Bible in order to figure out what it means to be a Christian. So reading the Bible on your own is really a bad way to figure out what I believe, what you and I believe. Reading the Bible with the aid of a Christian to kind of tell you, okay, this is what we think is more significant, and this is how we kind of read this book and that book, that sort of thing. That can be very helpful. But reading the Bible directly is not really a good method. Here's another one. Muslims meeting together probably are going to be much more comfortable talking to other Muslims than to Christians, right? Trust a fellow Muslim to kind of tell you the truth. What might really be attractive is to talk to someone who used to be a Christian and now is a Muslim. And I have been to a dozen mosques, and in every mosque I've been to, there are plenty of people who grew up Christian or were very familiar with Christianity at some point, and then became Muslims. There's lots of these people around. So it might be nice to talk to someone, it might feel nice to talk to someone who grew up Christian and can give us Muslims the inside story on Christianity. Is anyone here comfortable with somebody who converted from Christianity to Islam, telling Muslims about what it is that Christians believe? I know a lot of people, you do too, a lot of people who at one point really were good, solid Christians, who moved away from Christianity for whatever reason. None of them, as far as I'm concerned, would be good people for explaining what it is that I believe. So if we wouldn't want Muslims to learn about Christianity from someone who converted, then I think we should be very, very cautious about listening to people who grew up Muslim and then became Christian. And there are a lot of these people around who come and they talk with authority because I was a Muslim, I grew up Muslim, I know what Islam is like. Became Christians and then start to talk to Christians about Islam. If we would be uncomfortable with people who grew up Christian, converted to Islam, and then are talking about Christianity, we should be very cautious about listening to people who grew up Muslim, converted to Christianity, and now are trying to explain Islam to us. And we might think about some of the reasons why we would be uncomfortable. Those people may be helpful, but what they have to say, it's possible they can be helpful, but it's not nearly enough to listen to those kinds of people. We can also watch news. Our Muslim friends can watch news about what actually happens in Christian countries. United States, okay. All right, we don't like that. All right, I was going to talk about the United States. The majority of Americans are Christians all over. All right. Probably not good. Okay. What happens in Muslim countries may not reflect the way Muslims who take Islam seriously, what they really believe. And I think that that's what we're after. We want to know what about Muslims who really think well of their religion, who really take Islam seriously, what they actually believe. So these are bad ways, I think. And what's a good way for a Muslim to learn about Christianity? And I've already okay, here's some good answers. So read the Bible, but read it with Christian guidance somehow. Read it with a Christian there. Talk to actual practicing Christians. Not converts, but talk to people who really are Christians and who really think well of Christianity and really do try to be good Christians. Those are the people that our Muslim friends should talk to if they want to learn about Christianity. And then they can also watch and read things that are created by practicing Christians. So, now the question, how can Christians or Muslims believe? We need to talk to practicing Muslims. Muslims who actually try to be Muslims, who actually follow what they think Islam is. We can read the Quran. I think the Quran is great to read, but we must be read with Muslim guidance. What many people do, which really frustrates me, is that people take a single verse out of the Quran and they say, okay, this is what Muslims believe. Now, I don't know any Christian at all that thinks that it's fine to pull verses out of the Bible, especially these verses that talk about God's judgment and destruction and all sorts of things, and try to claim that this is what Christians believe. But all the time, I see people pulling single verses out of the Quran and saying, no, this is really what the Quran teaches or what Muslims believe. believe, or whatever else like that. No, it's not, we can't do that with the Bible. We should not be doing that with the Quran. We read the Quran, but we read the Quran with Muslim guidance. And when we look for news of people that are actually practicing Muslims, people who actually are taking Islam seriously. Okay, now can you learn from non-Muslims? I hope so, because I'm not a Muslim, and I'm trying to convince you that you can learn from me. So I thought I should include this. The data on Islam, data must come from practicing Muslims. So I spent, some of you know I take this seriously. I've gone to a dozen mosques. I've had many lunches and conversations with actual Muslims besides my reading. I started off, I'll tell you how I began. I was doing my Ph.D. in Bible, and I had just taken my doctoral exams. And so it was time to start teaching. And Sargeant Reynolds Community College in Richmond was creating an introduction to Islam class. So they desperately needed a professor who had religion credits on his transcript. That's the way academia works. I desperately needed a job, so it was a perfect marriage. Perfect. And it turned out that Islam was fun. I liked it. And so I began reading books, and I began visiting mosques. I took groups of students to mosques. I taught this course probably about six or seven times, and I began teaching other courses in religion that involved Islam. So while I was doing that, I was very careful to go to actually visit mosques and look for Muslims and get into long conversations, going out to lunch, meeting them and talking to a lot. So when I'm speaking to you, I'm really trying very hard to draw on the beliefs and the feelings and the practices of people who are truly practicing Muslims. We need to consider the bias of experts who compare religions. So anyone who's actually teaches religion or studies religion, we all have to think about our bias. I have a bias. I'm a Christian, and I don't apologize for that. So we all, when we're listening to people who are comparing Islam to some other religion, Islam to Christianity, we need to think just a little bit about where they're coming from. And then we also have to understand that all religions actually change over time and very often over distance. What Christians believed 200 or 200 years ago is not what Christians believe today. If we were doing this, I don't know a whole lot about the history of St. Andrews. I imagine that if we had this meeting 75 years ago in St. Andrews, whites and blacks would not be sitting together. And many people would feel that was completely in accordance with Christianity, completely in accordance with what God believes. Christianity is not the same as it was. Islam also changes, and what most Muslims believe today is different than what Muslims believed 100 years ago. So we have to focus on today, and just understand that Islam changes just as Christianity changes. All right. Now, here's a question. How do we know who is and is not a true Muslim? I'm trying to suggest that we listen to people who really are Muslims. And so what we do is we look for Muslims who represent the majority. Now, I talked a little bit about what I think it means to be a Christian. And I'm confident that most Christians in the world feel basically the way I do, that I think that Jesus was God, and that the key to having a good relationship with God is through Jesus Christ, that the way God speaks to us is through the Bible. So these are things that most Christians believe. We want to look to Muslims who represent the majority in order to understand what it is that makes you a Muslim. I use the term mainstream Muslims. And as a Christian, I get to decide who is and who is not a Christian. If you want to know who a Christian is, I can say what we include, who we don't include. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, my wife's church, gets to decide who is and who is not allowed to be a member. We don't listen to Muslims. Muslims don't have a vote in telling us who's a member and who's not. I'm actually a member of First Baptist Church of Newport News. It's a very, very friendly church, but we, members of First Baptist Church, decide who is a Christian and can join our church and who is not. We get to decide the definition of Christianity, who's in and who's out. And Muslims may have ideas about who should be a Christian and who shouldn't be, but they don't get a vote. In the same way, when we're talking about who is and who is not a Muslim, we also should look to the mainstream, look to the vast majority. And we allow the vast majority of Muslims to define who is and is not a true Muslim. I insist on doing that for Christians. I insist on defining who. Now we're having, interestingly, there's this, we've been talking about white supremacy, and especially in our Commonwealth of Virginia, white supremacy. It's not unusual for people who were part of these white supremacist groups to call themselves Christian. And there are even churches. Some of them even meet in churches and quote the Bible and have statements of faith calling themselves Christian. Now, many Christians, as you all know, have spoken very strongly against these groups and have insisted that if you're a white supremacist, then you cannot be Christian. Okay, fine. If we as Christians can say white supremacy doesn't fit with Christianity, then we need to allow mainstream Muslims to say, if you are a terrorist and if you think that it's good or right or acceptable to kill innocent people in order to get what you want, you know what? You're not a Muslim. You're not truly a Muslim. And it doesn't matter if you say, glory to God. It doesn't matter if God is great. It doesn't matter if you pray 5 times a day or quote the Quran. You're still not a Muslim because you are violating what we, the mainstream, says is a basic tenet of Islam. Okay? We get to make decisions and rules about Christianity, which is appropriate. Muslims, the mainstream Muslims, the vast majority, should be allowed to make rules about who is and who is not Muslim. All right. Now, I will tell you that all the mosques in Hampton Roads, not a whole bunch, there's 4 of them, but they are all part of what I'm calling mainstream Muslim. And most mosques, just about all the mosques in the United States, are part of this, part of what we call mainstream. So again, Muslims get to say what is Islam and what is not Islam, not other people. All right. Now, here's the question for us: what is Islam? And this is going to surprise some of you, but Islam is actually based on Old Testament Judaism, and it's influenced by New Testament Christianity. Islam is actually it's kind of a modified form of Judaism. It's very close to Judaism in many ways, and we'll see that as we're going through this. Now, this may sound counterintuitive to a lot of you, because in the United States we like to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the reason we do that is that Christianity itself really needs Judaism, because Christians, all churches, just about every denomination that I know of, through the history of Christianity, we've always insisted that the Old Testament is part of our Bible. This has kind of been a very, very basic thing, even before, say, the Apostles' Creed. We've always insisted that the Old Testament is part of our Bible. So Christianity really needs to have Judaism as part of its identity. So from that we get sort of what we call the Judeo-Christian ethic, that we both accept the Old Testament as scripture and as authoritative, and as something that speaks for God. But the religion itself, the religion of Islam is much closer to Judaism than Christianity is. Judaism is much more like Islam than it is like Christianity. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but we'll see that more as we go on. Now, Islam is certainly influenced by New Testament Christianity, and in fact, Muslims see that they are following a religious tradition that begins with Judaism and continues through Jesus Christ. That Moses and Jesus are very, very, very important prophets, and that Muhammad is simply extending the teaching that Moses and Jesus made. I also wanted to stress this, that Islam is really a religion and not a faith. And there's a difference, and this tells us something about Islam. Okay, Islam values orthopraxy above orthodoxy. So when you teach college, you have these fancy words. Students think you're smart. Orthopraxy means right behavior. I didn't memorize these verses, but orthodoxy means right behavior. Judaism and Islam stress behavior, that God approves of us based on our behavior. We have to try to do the right things, and that's really what God cares about. Christianity is rather unique among religions of the world in that we tend to talk more about belief. Most Christians talk a little bit more about believing the right things. Does anybody, what's the, I put Ephesians 2:8 and 9. What do you think the most important verse is in the Bible as a Christian? Okay, a lot of people like John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Christianity tends to stress belief. You believe the right things, and then you can go to heaven. Judaism, and in fact most of the Old Testament actually, seem to teach that if you do the right things, that's really what God's interested in. Islam tends to think of things in the same way. That God is really interested in your behavior, that you're trying to do what's right. So Judaism and Islam stress orthopraxy, right behavior. Christianity expresses right belief. And that's why Islam is better. It's better, I think, not to try to call Islam a faith. Christianity is a faith because we like to think about belief. When we compare Christianity to something else, we might start off the conversation with, okay, we Christians believe this, what do you Muslims believe? And a Muslim can certainly have that conversation with a Christian. But Muslims generally are thinking much, much more about behavior. If a Muslim is going to initiate the conversation, he or she may well say, well, this is what we do in order to try to do what God wants us to do. This is what we do. What do you Christians actually do? So Jews and Muslims are more likely to talk about behavior. And Christians will talk about belief or faith. This is why I think it's usually not a good idea to speak of Islam as a faith, or talk about the Islamic faith, because Islam and Judaism, and actually most religions, really talk much more about behavior and less about what you're supposed to believe. All right, the goal of Islam is to create and support a just society. And really everything that we talk about with respect to Islam is this idea of justice. There's a passion for creating justice. And within that, there are these two, I guess, kind of fundamental ideas. That all human beings are equal, and that all human beings should follow God's will. So everything else that we talk about with Islam fits within these two passions. We're interested in justice. And the key to justice is obeying God. If we all obey God, then we're going to end up with a fairer society, a more just society. All right, and so talk about Muslim ritual. Now, some of you, call them the 5 pillars of Muslim practice. I think many of you have heard about this. Many people don't realize that Islam also has 6 pillars of Muslim faith. And the reason that you might not know the pillars of faith is, well, as I explained it to you, Muslims are much more interested in talking about what to do than what to believe. And Muslims themselves are much more familiar with their pillars of practice of what to do than they are with the pillars of faith. So tonight I'm going to focus on the first pillar, and I'll be talking about the other pillars next week. So. So the first pillar of practice actually is this phrase. It's called the Shahada. There's no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet. And this revises a very important verse in Judaism, or in the Old Testament. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Now, any people Jewish? Have any of you gone to a synagogue? Okay, if you've gone to a synagogue service, you may well have probably heard this verse. Because in any synagogue, doesn't matter whether it's Orthodox or conservative or Reformed, there's a part of every service where people recite this verse together. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord our alone. And some of you may know that Jesus himself actually quotes the verse after this that says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might and all your strength. And Jesus says that this is the most important of the commandments. Probably the earliest Muslims were taught this verse by Jews. There were Jewish people living in the first Muslim communities. And you can see a kind of relationship between the beginning of the Shahada and this verse. Now, why don't Muslims just accept the Shema? If they like the Shema so much, it's so important to Jews, why not just accept it? And there's a couple of issues with this. First of all, let's go back to that slide. First of all, the Shema begins, Hear, O Israel. The Shema is addressed to Jewish people only. In Judaism, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they are expressly written for Jewish people. Jews will teach that God certainly loves the rest of us, but the Torah is specially designed and specially addressed to Jews. The Shema is addressed to Jewish people. And probably the earliest Muslims, while they liked Judaism very much, it was uncomfortable to have to be sort of second-class religious practitioners. So this is one of the issues. The other issue is that the Shema comes from Moses. Moses is the authority, and not ready to accept the Old Testament. So instead of the Shema, the Shahada. What the Shahada teaches is a couple of things. First of all, it's strict. What Shahada teaches is strict monotheism. There's no God but God. That's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the Shema. The Shahada says there is no God but God. So it stresses a strict monotheism. Now, most Christians, I think most of us agree that there's only one God. That's basic Christian teaching. Islam, though, doesn't really like this idea of the Trinity. A lot of Muslims that I talk to really kind of walk around thinking that Christians believe in three gods. Sort of like a God by committee thing. I'm not sure. And one of the reasons that I have a lot of trouble explaining the Trinity to Muslims is that I don't really understand it myself. How it is that somehow we believe in one God but three persons. And I gotta say, even as a Christian, there's an awful lot of times where when Jesus is praying, that it kind of looks like, it really looks like there's two different, Jesus is a person, God is up there. It kind of looks like there's two different ones. And to try to work that into monotheism, that's really hard. And Muslims don't enjoy that. Jewish people also don't enjoy that. So when I say monotheism, they're saying, okay, one God, there's no splitting, there's no kind of 3 in 1 or whatever. Also, second issue related to that is that Islam insists that God and humans must be separate. You get to be one or the other. Either you're God or you're human. You don't get to be both. And again, that's another one where it's very hard for me to try to explain to Muslims that Jesus can be 100% human and 100% God at the same time. And it's even harder, again, there's all these passages in the Bible where it sure looks like Jesus is like a human being talking to God. So that's another complicated one. It's also another one I don't really quite understand too well. So Islam looks at that, and a lot of early Muslim writing actually is kind of trying to convince Christians that this doesn't make any sense. This idea that you can be a man and God. That just the basic idea of Jesus as somehow as a human being and also as divine. That just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So there is no God but God. Muslims understand this to be a kind of strict monotheism. They like monotheism. Monotheism is good. The idea of a good God is really neat. But there is absolutely no room for a Trinity or for this idea of the divinity of Christ. So that's what we're thinking when we say there's no God but God. And Jewish people, when Jewish people read the Shema, they look at the Shema in the same way. You can't split up God into 3, and you absolutely cannot have a human being, somebody being human and God at the same time. All right. The second part of the Shema is I think, very fascinating. Okay, Muhammad is God's prophet. The significance of this is that we should follow the teachings of Muhammad. Muhammad is the last and greatest of God's prophets. So Islam recognizes that there were many prophets before Muhammad. Prophets, people who spoke for God, spoke with authority for God. And I think many of you know that Muslims tend to accept Jesus and Moses as very important, very significant prophets. But with the Shahada, when we say Muhammad is God's prophet, what we're saying is that everything that we know about God, everything that we know about the way we're supposed to behave, must come from Muhammad. In Judaism, the Torah traditionally is written by Moses. Jews also have something called the Talmud. Some of you may have heard of that. The Talmud also, believe it or not, comes from Moses, just in a different form. Judaism looks to Moses as their one single human authoritative teacher. And everything Jews do or believe is supposed to come from Moses. So Islam takes away Moses and instead substitutes Muhammad. So when we recite the Shahada, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, we're saying, first of all, we have this very clear, easy to understand definition of monotheism. And everything that we understand to be true about how we're supposed to behave and what we're supposed to, everything that we believe, must somehow come from Muhammad. Now, this word prophet is interesting for another reason. Look at the Bible a little bit. Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah. So Deuteronomy is supposed to be Moses' last speech. It's very, very long kind of speech where Moses sort of lays things out. And in Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses says, "Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet." So Moses is talking about a future prophet that has his same authority. Moses predicts the coming of another prophet. And the question is, who is Moses talking about? Now, who does the New Testament suggest is this prophet? Jesus, right? So we look to Jesus. And there's this one particularly fascinating passage. This is in Matthew and Mark and Luke. So let me read. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here if you wish. I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now what's important here is that we see Jesus and Moses and Elijah, another important prophet, having this conversation with witnesses. And then God speaks and he says, okay, of the 3, Jesus is the special one. So there's no question then that Jesus is now the most important prophet. And I think that that's the main point of this passage. Because God singles out Jesus and Moses is there watching. One of the most famous stories in the life of Muhammad is something called the Isra, and especially the Miraj. Call this in English, it's the night journey. And if you go on the internet and type in night journey, you can find lots and lots and lots of hits and descriptions of this story. There's kind of a reference in the Quran. There's more in other literature that I'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But in this story, Muhammad, in one night, he travels to Jerusalem, which is about 500 miles away from where he started. And then from there, he ascends to heaven, Miraj. And while he's in heaven, he meets Jesus and Moses and a number of other biblical figures. And everyone that Muhammad meets acknowledges that it is Muhammad who is the last and the greatest of the prophets. So I hope you see the relationship. In the New Testament acknowledges that Jesus is we could say, the final authoritative prophet and the greatest of the prophets. So Muslim tradition takes this story of the Transfiguration and now applies it to Muhammad. So Muhammad actually goes to heaven, and meets Jesus and Moses and Abraham and John the Baptist and a number of other figures. And everyone agrees that now it is Muhammad who is the greatest and the final prophet. So when Muslims say the Shahada, there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, or Muhammad is the prophet of God, acknowledging that we listen to Muhammad in order to know what God wants us to do. So therefore we follow the teaching of Muhammad. This is the Quran. Hadith literature is a set of stories that were all or most of them originate with Muhammad, that were told verbally and then kind of collected mostly in the 9th or the 10th century. So it's another body of literature. I'll be talking about this later, which is almost as authoritative as the Quran. And frankly, the Hadith literature is a lot easier to work with, which is why Muslims read it and why we read it. So, but anything that's authoritative comes from Muhammad. Muhammad is God's prophet. I think that's it. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there, and I'll talk about the other pillars and this concept of jihad next week. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
My assumption is that a prophet is someone who tells what God is saying to him. And I'm not sure I understand how the phrase, and Muhammad is God's prophet, means that all those other prophets don't count.
The most important, Muhammad is the most important, the most significant. If you're going to pick one, this is how Muslims understand it. You're going to pick one prophet to listen to Muhammad. So Christians would agree. If we're going to pick one person in the history of the world to listen to who's more authoritative than anybody else, it's going to be Jesus. Does it mean that Christians listen to Moses? Sure. Do we listen to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Paul, John the Baptist? Sure. We could say in some sense they're all prophets, they all speak for God. But the number one prophet, head and shoulders above anyone else, is Jesus. And this is what that phrase, Muhammad is God's prophet, means. That Muhammad is the one authority above everyone else, the one that we rely on. Yeah.
The word that you had in there, that Muhammad was the last prophet. That's different than most important.
I agree with you. It's a different concept, but both both are wrapped up into the same idea. So yes, Muhammad is the last. I think maybe the thinking is that we don't need a prophet after Muhammad. So there's a Christian idea that the Bible has finished being right. The canon is closed, we might say. We cannot add more stuff to the Bible. The Bible is done. God's finished writing the Bible. So there's an ending. There's an ending point. This is kind of, I think, the same idea. There is an end to God's authoritative speech. So Muslims would say, yes, God was speaking to prophets all the way through. He spoke to Abraham. He spoke to Moses. He spoke to David. He spoke to Jesus. These were all prophets. But once we get to Muhammad, and once the Quran is written and we collect the Hadith literature, that's it. God's not speaking in this way anymore. So Muhammad is both the last and the greatest. In the same sense, in the sense we would talk of Jesus as the last, and as the greatest and also the last. There might be people today that speak for God, but there's nothing that anyone can say that's going to end up in the Bible for Christians. Christians are finished writing the Bible. It's done. And that's the sense that Muhammad is both both last and great.
All right.
Sir.
We have witnesses that what God said to do.
Right.
Jesus said. Muhammad supposedly went to heaven. Did he come back and tell us about this? Or did somebody say, Muhammad went up there and all these people talked to him, and here's what they said? They don't know.
Right, yes, I agree, yeah. So the mirage is
Where did the stories come from then?
it comes from Muhammad. The story of the mirage comes from Muhammad. So that's correct, yes. Yes, I agree. There are parts of, so yes, I mean, I see what you're saying. There's no witness to this
Well,
event.
how did it come from Muhammad if he was up there?
Oh, at the end of the mirage, he comes back. The mirage and the,
Muhammad went up and came back down?
in one night, right, yes. Yes, it's miraculous, yes. Yes, so Muhammad went up, he came down, and then he explained the story. Yes.
I understand that many Muslims, when they say the name Muhammad, say, and holy be his name, or something like that.
Right, yes.
And I'm wondering, does that cross over into worship of Muhammad, do you think?
I think mostly they say peace be upon him.
Peace be upon him.
Muslims, I don't think there are Muslims that worship Muhammad at all, except some very strange groups. Muslims, if you talk to them, and I've talked to them many times, they will insist that Muhammad must be as human as anybody else. So this is they will insist that it is completely improper and unacceptable to worship Muhammad.
What about pictures or likenesses of Muhammad? Isn't that banned?
Yes, usually it's banned. The way most Muslims explain this is that to make a picture is sort of puts you kind of on the path to worship. That if you even make a picture of him, that's a kind of worship. The way Muhammad kind of sort of gets started is that he tries to end idol worship, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so Muhammad is the beginning of Islam. In order to try to get to this principle that everyone should worship the one God, we have to get rid of all of these idols. So Islam comes into formation when Arabic tribes are warring with each other. Every tribe has their own individual god or their own group of gods, their own group of idols. And the significant, important thing that Muhammad does is that he destroys idols. So one of the interesting things is that if you go into a mosque, into the prayer room, you will not see pictures of people on the walls.
Or animals.
Or animals, right. What you see is they do a lot of really interesting calligraphy. You might see sorts of pictures of kinds of plants. So I think many of you know arabesque style, arabesque art. Okay, sort of kind of rotating, kind of plant work style. So most Muslims don't go for pictures of really anybody. It's inappropriate because we want to be very careful that we are not worshiping Muhammad.
We went to Israel and Egypt, and we were advised to wear plain T-shirts, not to have any images on the T-shirts. And when we were there, we saw very few pictures of either people or animals on a T-shirt.
Okay, yeah, that hadn't occurred to me, but I guess that makes sense. Sure. Yes.
What is known about Muhammad's boyhood? Just growing up, we have this whole, story of Jesus and the birth and the temple and so on. What is known about Muhammad's life?
I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So these are, I guess, the biography of Muhammad is very important for Muslims. So Muhammad, there's much more to his biography, and it actually fits in with the Quran. So one of the technical terms that religion people use is the term exemplar, that a person to imitate. And when I talk about this, I know that Christians believe, I know that we're taught to imitate Christ. And when I talk about this, I say that as exemplars go, Jesus is not very good. Because the Bible, the New Testament, says very, very little about his life. Muhammad is different. It's very important that Muhammad have a biography. So I'll be talking about that later. But there's a lot more in the Hadith literature about the biography of Muhammad. So, yes.
You mentioned other prophets, but does mainstream Islam allow following other prophets or just Muhammad?
No, Muhammad is the authority. Do Christians allow following, I don't know, some other prophet?
I thought that he was the only one that was supposed to follow.
Right. So we as Christians, we accept that Moses was a prophet, and that we should read the Old Testament and see what he has to say and do it. We accept that Isaiah was a prophet. We accept that Elijah was a prophet. But Jesus is really the one that we're most interested in. And so Islam takes the same approach. Islam says, sure, Moses was a great prophet. Jesus was a great prophet. They did and taught great things. But the one we're really interested in is Muhammad. Yes, sir.
When did Muhammad live, and was that the beginning of Islam?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at this. There's kind of there's what Muslims believe, and then there's what historians and religious scholars conclude. So, from the kind of academic, historical point of view, there's very little what we would call good, solid historical information. The Muhammad. What Muslims tend to believe is that Muhammad was born around 570 and lived to 632. And again, I'll be talking about his biography in some detail in a couple of weeks. So 570 to 6. And yes, Islam begins while Muhammad is living. And there's a Muslim calendar that their year zero is, I think around
610?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, around 610 or. I think it's later than that. I think it's about 620. But I'll explain why how this fits into the life of Muhammad. So sure.
One thing about Islam is I deal some with some of the people I run into in the mosque we went up to in Kansas. They go there. But what fascinates me about Islam is when you said it's really a religion and not a faith. Well, I mean, Judaism is a religion too.
I'm with you 100%. That's right.
So the tenet of Islam is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind.
Judaism,
and Christianity, but they say the same thing, that there's only one God, and He's supreme. But in their beliefs, they say that all people, everybody here is my brother. And secondly, I treat the second tenet of Jesus as to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what they seek to do.
You're talking about Muslims.
Muslims, they try to treat everybody so in their business dealings, they're not going to screw you over because then it's benefit them. That's the problem I have with Christianity, is that we have all these high virtues, but in our business life and everything else, we screw everybody over. It's a different set of morals. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, they try, what I'm trying to say, I think to them, they try to live their faith. And Christians should be doing the same thing. It
A lot of us do. I can't have this. But, I mean, it's very simple. There's one God, and then we're all equal. The second thing is love you as my brother and sister.
Thank you. Yeah. I can say that there are very good Christians, and then there are Christians that don't always behave very well. But we accept them as Christians, and it's the same in the Islamic world. Not all Muslims actually do everything they're supposed to do. But what I do want to try to show is that the pillars, when we look at the next week, they're designed to try to promote that idea that all people are equal, and that we should be good to each other. So your test was okay?
I probably crapped up on it. I got through it. My question was, the Quran, was that written by a single author, or was it written over a long period by many authors, or does it have a long history? Or?
It's the same thing, similar to the question about Muhammad. I can talk about scholarly answers, but Muslims, traditional Islam teaches that the Quran all comes from Muhammad, and that most of it was Muhammad receives a revelation from God and then tells someone, and then someone else writes it down. And that these are revelations that Muhammad receives over the last 22 years of his life, and then were collected a few years after he died and put together to form the Quran. So this is one of the differences between the Quran and the Bible, and I'll be talking about this in a little more detail next time. The Bible, as you know, is 66 books written by a slew of people, all different people. None of them Jesus. Some of the New Testament quotes Jesus, but Jesus didn't write anything. The Quran is supposed to be one book, 100% the words of Muhammad. So that's maybe an important difference between the two. So I think we're over time. Should I end it and then we can stay around?
Yeah.
Is that wise? Okay.